Hello, everyone. I'm Erik Stegman. I'm the CEO here at Native Americans and Philanthropy. My mother's family is from the Carry the Kettle Nakoda First Nation, and I'm really excited to share some time with you today as part of our membership education sessions where we bring you important perspectives from the field. And today we are talking about land acknowledgement and how philanthropy can avoid being performative and help you navigate the complexities inherent in building relationships with Indigenous communities. I'll begin by saying what land acknowledgements are and are not. Indigenous land acknowledgements honor and respect the land of Indigenous peoples and communities, past and present, as well as future generations. When they are meaningful, it helps create space where people feel welcome and can recognize themselves and welcome their guests. Where land acknowledgements can go wrong is when it's offered without action or an understanding of the true history of how philanthropy has built its wealth, which has its roots in the extraction of resources from the land. Even as recently as 2021, while Americans gave nearly $500 billion, our most recent data points to less than 0.5% that has gone to Native American communities and causes. This is why we feel it is so vital that we have the conversation about moving beyond land acknowledgements into meaningful relationship building and action. To share more about this perspective today, I'm talking with Greg Masten, our Vice President of Tribal Nations Engagement and Special Projects. He works with our Tribal Nations Initiative and has been holding listening sessions with tribal leaders across the country for the past year. Greg, can you introduce yourself and then share your experience in working with tribal nations and also share your thoughts on what successful land acknowledgements can look like?
Yes, thank you, Erik. It's wonderful to join you today. So my name is Greg Masten. I'm a member of the Yurok tribe. I'm also a descendant of the Hupa and the Karuk peoples. And I think to really start thinking about land acknowledgement, you need to start, you want to do it in a good way and do it intentionally. So thinking, organizationally, what does this mean for your organization and what is the purpose behind it? And recognizing that the first step is acknowledgement. There is no healing, no accountability, no peace, and no equity without first acknowledging, the first peoples of that land. I think the second thing is in recognizing that and thinking about the people and the land acknowledgement, understanding what that land means to them and that close connection that they have with it. Many times it's a part of their creation stories, their origin stories. And so it means something to them as well, and understanding what that meaning is. And I recall speaking with one of the tribal leaders in our listening sessions, Chairman Franklin of the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians. And they were even in situations where they didn't have a legal claim to a certain portion of their land anymore. But he said, we never gave up ownership of that land. We were still deeply tied to that land. The next important piece, Erik, when considering a land acknowledgement is really reaching out to the native peoples of that land directly and talking to them and understanding, what wording they're comfortable with, understanding their history. And also, not a lot of people know this. They may see on a piece of paper the legal name of that tribe, but that may not be what those tribal people call themselves. So you really want to understand dig into it and get the real perspective on what a true land acknowledgement should be, including what is their correct name.
Thanks, Greg. Those are some great points. And yeah, as one example, my tribe, the Carry the Kettle First Nation, or the Nakoda people, which is our traditional name, but in some cases our relatives go by Assiniboine here, which was a colonial name. So these are some of the things that we all deal with when we're really trying to make sure that we're being respectful in how our local people like to refer to themselves. So I'm glad you brought that point up. We hear a lot in the field about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, especially now. And in the past few years, we've been hearing a lot about allyship with Indigenous communities. We've seen some great examples of this, and also people who are willing to learn that authentic allyship means going beyond simply checking the box, which we've all dealt with for a long time. How land acknowledgements fit in this framework of allyship is that there should be intentional and a well-researched statement. This doesn't have to be perfect, but there should be work involved and a commitment to uncovering the truth. When it's paired with action, relationship building, and investment, we see a real change. That action can include citing Indigenous thinkers, using your platform to amplify Indigenous voices, supporting local sovereignty protection efforts, and centering relationships with the land. There's a lot individuals can do in this process, which is part of what we want to point to with these land acknowledgements. At NAP, we recognize that land is not merely an economic asset for Indigenous peoples. It's a defining element for our identity, our culture, and our relationship to ancestors and future generations. So, Greg, can you share a little bit more about how philanthropy can take action beyond just the recognition and what you're hearing from the field, especially in some of these listening sessions?
Yes, that's a great question, Erik. I think that, going back to the first comment earlier about what is the intent and purpose, there has to be an action followed with it. Otherwise, it can just be empty words. And I've been in meetings, unfortunately, where it does feel like it's empty words, where it feels like they're acknowledging the peoples of that land, but then where's the substance behind it, to follow? So I think first and foremost, thinking about how are we wanting to engage and work with that tribe as true partners, not just checking a box. And that can look like a lot of different things, not only because there's so many tribes and they're so diverse, but they're all at different levels in terms of their needs and their capacity and the history that has, impacted them. So I've seen examples, obviously, of directly funding a project or an initiative that is a priority of that community. I've seen instances where a foundation is actually paying an amount to that tribe because they're on that tribe's ancestral lands, almost like a rent or a lease of some kind. Even though there's no legal obligation to do that, they felt like there was an ethical obligation to do that. And that was their way to show respect to the first stewards of that land. So there's a lot of ways that can look. But I think first and foremost, in truly engaging them and understanding them, you're going to learn through that relationship the best way to partner and support them.
Yeah, those are some great examples. And another example that comes to mind where some really deep work is done at the foundation level is the Northwest Area Foundation, which, their territory covers the whole top half of the country. And that was all derived from a railroad fortune that really did a lot of damage to our communities and our relatives across the West. But I think around 2/3 of their funding is now being directed toward tribal nations as another example. So there, I think, are a lot of ways that funders can repair some of these relationships, not fully, but can move toward a better place with healing and recognition of the damage that's been done in the past. And a lot of this comes down to power and the power in a funder relationship with a nonprofit or a tribe. And so I think the other thing that's important with these land acknowledgements is it's about acknowledging that power. And if we alter these fundamentals in philanthropy by promoting more equitable and effective philanthropy in Native community, it fosters a value that's important to all Native people, which is reciprocity. As Native people, we are philanthropic by our own values across all our cultures. And that power is an inherent and central part of those philanthropic relationships as a Western institution. So when funders can approach funding practice and relationship building with reciprocity as a central value, it means a more thoughtful, intentional, and humble approach to power. So asking yourself, who's on your board, who's in the seats of power, who's making those decisions is really important. We still don't have nearly enough Native people in those positions, both working at the staff level, the executive level, and then definitely as trustees for funders. So there's a long way to go to achieve those better relations and to try to work toward that reciprocity. And we're really here as a partner for you to do that here at Native Americans in Philanthropy. Greg, any final thoughts on sort of what you've been hearing from a tribe's perspective or from your own?
Yeah, Erik, a couple of things come to mind. I think first, just acknowledging where a lot of this comes from. We all understand that there's a terrible history that this country hasn't fully come to reconciliation with. And so I think for our philanthropic partners out there, understanding that and wanting to be a part of the healing process and supporting these communities, I think, is a huge first step. Also understanding, the history, some of the very foundations upon which we're talking about. That funding could have come from extractive industries that were destructive to the land and or the peoples that come from that land. So I think there is an obligation, a historical obligation. I think as community partners, there's an obligation. And just as human beings, as you mentioned, Native peoples have always been philanthropic. We may not have used that word philanthropy, but it was a part of our culture to help those in need and not take more than we needed. And so I think this is a real good opportunity for philanthropy to really embrace Native peoples in a new way and in an authentic way. So I congratulate the foundations out there that are taking this step to really understand our histories and to connect with our communities. And so I look forward to continuing to build those relationships with them. And my hope and my dream is that we can get it to a level where it's not just trendy at times, which is one thing that I've seen, but we actually truly embrace these long-term partnerships. And you mentioned that 3/4 of the portfolio of the Northern Area Foundation is now supporting Native peoples. I would love to see other foundations take that step and really institutionalize within their portfolios support for Native American peoples. And maybe it's not 3/4 of their portfolio. Maybe it's not even 50%, maybe even 10% makes sense for them, but some portion of their portfolios will be dedicated annually to supporting Native peoples.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think those are some good actions to call out. And, I hope that viewers are learning a little bit more about the context of this discussion today. I think especially as we move into Native American Heritage Month and a lot of our partners and organizations are lifting up and promoting our communities, this is a good time to really think about how you're engaging with this land acknowledgement process. And we've got some amazing foundations and other funder members out there who are doing this work. We're excited to keep engaging you all in this community, and we really encourage you to reach out in any way we can be helpful. And we hope that that begins today with this amazing session. So I'm excited to share with you our next discussion for our membership education series, which is Moving Beyond Philanthropy Beyond Land Acknowledgements, which is moderated by our very own Joe Moffitt.
Thank you, Eric and Greg, for such an insightful and informative discussion. I really appreciate your leadership at Native Americans Philanthropy. And welcome, everyone. Tatsalap, Himima Kala Tiwama, Ina Monique Wast, Tamyopsayo. Good day, friends and relatives. My name is Joel Moffitt. I'm a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe, and I am serving as the Director of Environmental and Special Projects at Native Americans in Philanthropy. Thank you all for joining us today for this important discussion. At Native Americans in Philanthropy, we recognize that individuals, tribes, and tribal communities have different perspectives on what land acknowledgements should look like. To help bring further awareness to this topic, today we're highlighting the voices of funders that we think are doing it right through action. It's my pleasure to welcome two of those funders, Marisol Inzunza and Shawn Escoffery. Thank you both for being here. Please tell us about yourself. Marisol, let's start with you.
Hello, hola, Haminat. I'm humbled to be here. Thank you for this invitation to be here today. I'm a program officer for the California Wellness Foundation, and I help oversee the Leading for Power and Change portfolio, which is a portfolio that focuses on racial justice and uplifts the voices of those that have been historically excluded from society. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol. Shawn, please tell us about yourself.
Yep. Hey, Shawn Escoffery. I'm the CEO of the Roy and Patricia Disney Family Foundation. I've been in philanthropy for over 10 years now. Brand new, well, relatively new to LA still, 4 years, and leading the foundation for the last 4 years. We focus on criminal justice reform, affordable housing preservation, and environmental justice. And we have a strong racial equity and gender equity lens to our work.
Well, thank you, Marisol and Shawn, for being here today. I've been with NAP for about a year in this position, and prior to working in philanthropy, I was focused on natural resource policy work, working with the Northwest tribes here at Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. It's an intertribal organization. And prior to that, I served on my tribal council as vice chairman and treasurer. So I'm really excited to dive into this discussion here today. First, I'd like to also inform the audience who's watching today that you can put your questions into the chat, and we'll weave them in during this discussion. It's going to be more of a free-flowing, informal discussion, and we'll try to get to all your questions. So the first question I'll toss to Marisol. I'm excited to learn about your journey to becoming an authentic ally for Indigenous communities. How did you become involved with Native Americans in philanthropy?
Thanks for that question. Well, previously, working right now, I work with California Wellness Foundation, but previously I worked for over 15 years for the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, a federally recognized tribe in San Bernardino County in California. And, when I started the work, I frankly didn't even know there was a tribe near my home, only 17 miles from here. I never learned that in school, unfortunately. So I was looking for work straight out of college, and I saw this job for public affairs, and I thought, oh, that seems like interesting. So I started working for them right when their gaming was starting to boom, and I got really fortunate to see them go from a small bingo hall to what the tribe is now. And within 2 years into working, the tribe asked me if I was interested in working in philanthropy, and I said, "What's that?" Right? I didn't know what that was. And they, when they told me about charitable giving, I was like, oh, yeah, of course. Those values align with what I believe in. And they were so responsible in wanting to do it right? Not just wanting to cut a check and give out money, because they knew that giving out money is easy to do, but giving it away responsibly is hard. So we hired a consultant, and all of us in the team learned about charitable giving, about what the needs were. They interviewed tribal members as to what they wanted to support. So we established, and I helped lead this grant-making department that was giving away over $35 million a year to tribal nations. And that's how I was first introduced to Native Americans in philanthropy. My first convening I attended was in 2008 in Gila River. And I remember that first convening, there was only about 40 of us. And we stood around, and that's when Joy Persall was the executive director, and we stood around in a circle, and we took off our shoes, and we held hands, and I knew it was different. And from then, the programming was culturally rich and profound. And since then, I've been a huge fan of NAP.
Well, thanks for that, Marisol. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I've only been in philanthropy for a year now, so I'm there with you. You took me back to that time in your life when you're just understanding the whole field and the players and the power dynamics and how it's structured and how little tribes have been involved in the sector. But as you mentioned, we've always been generous. We've always been giving. We just called it a different name. It wasn't philanthropy, but tribes have always been generous in giving to their communities. And so I really appreciate that perspective from you. Shawn, can you tell me a little bit more about how you became involved with Native Americans in philanthropy?
Sure. Yeah, so we started funding sort of in a Native community during COVID. Really just a set of grants to respond to what was happening on Native lands. I think we moved close to $500,000 to different organizations. And at the same time, over the last couple of years, for us as a foundation, we were acknowledging that we had blind spots in terms of groups that weren't getting funding. We pride ourselves in identifying organizations led by people of color, just really focusing on BIPOC-led organizations, but we are still missing, Native groups, we were missing Asian Pacific Islanders as well. And I definitely want to do something about that. And then at the same time, there was just a lot more land acknowledgements happening in philanthropic circles. I don't know when it became like the thing to do, but in the beginning of every single meeting, it started with the land acknowledgement. And I remember being in the middle of Zoom hell, and everyone's going around in a circle doing their land acknowledgements. And then I'm looking at a room full of hundreds of millions of dollars. And I know for a fact, 99.9% of them aren't funding Native issues. So I said that I would not do a land acknowledgement until I moved at least $1 million to Native issues. And it was, one, because we're in philanthropy and what we do with money, I didn't feel that I had the right to sort of do the land acknowledgement until I actually really did some action in terms of moving resources. So I actually gave Erik a call and talked to him about, we kind of want to figure this out. And we don't want to sit around for a few months and develop a strategy. As a foundation, we want to move money first, develop strategy with leaders. So, in conversation with Erik, we sort of we talked about investing in Native American philanthropy. We became members of Native American philanthropy, so prior to that. And then, over the past year, we've moved close to $2 million now.
Wow, that's impressive, Shawn. Yeah, thank you for taking that leadership. I know it's difficult when you're in those giant Zoom rooms with 100 people, and it's at times hard to take a position that isn't with the group, and especially if it's even if it's constructive, even if you're just taking a different perspective and reminding them that this is just right now it's almost getting into performative, like Greg and Erik had talked about. And I've been in those spaces, and it's it's cringe. It's cringeworthy at times. And especially when it doesn't come from it's coming from a good place, but they a lot of times they have not reached out. They've done their research. A lot of them have done their research and read about the history of where they are at and the land that they are occupying. But to really reach out and develop those relationships and have conversations with the tribes and the indigenous communities in their area and have them guide and develop the land acknowledgement, that and then carry it a step further, Shawn, like you, and actually invest in the communities. That is what real allyship, real partnership means. And so thank you for taking that leadership, because it's tough when you're in those Zoom rooms. Marisol, can you expand on that? And because we know that the idea and practice of land acknowledgements can differ. Sure. Mentioned 574 federally recognized tribes across the country. There are many more tribes that are only state recognized, or some aren't even state recognized, but they're indigenous communities. Important to further and turn that land acknowledgement into action through giving.
Sure. So, in my previous role working for the tribe, I saw firsthand how the philanthropic sector failed our Native communities. I saw this time and time again, reviewing proposals that came in from Native-led nonprofits and the lack of support they would receive from funders. And I remember getting these proposals because when I worked for the tribe, we accepted proposals throughout the United States from tribal nonprofits and tribal nations, and they'd have no other funders. And we'd ask during the site visits, like, where's everybody? Why aren't you getting support? And they would tell us they don't fund us. They say our proposals aren't strong enough and so forth. So one of the first goals I had when I started at Cal Wellness was increasing funding to Native-led nonprofits in California. And, for me, it was important to increase funding because I knew the statistics, right? I'm sure we've all heard this here, that less than 1% of philanthropic funding goes to Native nonprofits. So I knew that I had to be an advocate. I was intentional about increasing funding to Native groups. And I knew a lot of the groups that were doing amazing work. And that was one of my questions actually during the interview to Cal Wellness is, what are you doing for Native communities? And my presentation centered around it, about what we can do and how we can do more to support Native communities. And the irony is that I had to leave a Native giving program to really have a seat at the table. Because the moment that I would go to these other convenings and we would talk to other funders, when they found out that I was working for tribal philanthropy, I would get disregarded because I wasn't the Gates Foundation. I wasn't, the Kellogg Foundation. People just wouldn't listen. So I knew that in order to make real change, I had to kind of break out of the bubble and try to get a seat at a foundation where others can really listen and be that advocate to these communities.
Thank you, Marisol.
And I love, Shawn, what you said. I agree. I mean, I started when everything went to Zoom and I would log on and I'd see these land acknowledgements. I'd be like, what's going on? Wait, where did this come from? What's going on? And then, the map and just you click on, and it felt so wrong. So thank you for calling that out.
Yeah. And thank you for both of you for making that change from the inside. Because as you said, it's difficult when you're working for a tribe or a Native nonprofit and trying to change the system or change minds and hearts. You need to be in the system a lot of the times. And I think that's what Native Americans in Philanthropy also supports, folks like yourselves and natives who are working inside these big foundations in philanthropy. So we are doing it, educating from all different angles. We at NAP believe that the work you have been doing, you've just educated us on your success in changing the field from within. That also serves as its own form of acknowledgement to the first stewards of this land. And that's done through investment in Indigenous communities. When it comes to working with Indigenous people, what do you think is most important for your colleagues in philanthropy to realize about the difference between a land acknowledgement and genuine action? And I'll toss this to Shawn.
Well, I think the thing that we don't do well in philanthropy as a field is listen, right? And I would start with listening first. And, if you're interested in funding Native communities and Native issues, talk to people and do more listening than you're doing talking, right? Don't sort of come in with the way you're seeing the world and your sort of specific programs. We could have walked in and said, okay, this is what we fund: criminal justice, affordable housing, and environmental justice, and then that's it, versus we're going to give general operating support. We're going to, over 2 years, have conversations, right? We need to learn. We're acknowledging that we don't know this space. We don't know these communities. We don't know where to start. So, we got, a bunch of experts. We have Native Americans in philanthropy. We know that we can call on you guys and your team to help us out. We know that we need to go to places. I've spent a couple times. I've been to South Dakota a couple times and got over my issues with horses. Still not ready to ride a horse yet, but I'm a work in progress there. But it was important to be on different lands and within different communities, and to learn, sort of Native practices. It's a different way of doing things. And if, for the folks in philanthropy in this room, if you're really interested in from this area, I would say really go out and see the work, meet communities, listen, and sort of really try to experience what it's like on the res. If you're funding rural issues, or with urban Native populations as well. But it really starts with really listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate you emphasizing that, because that a lot of times it's been a struggle for tribes and Native communities to tell their stories, and then when you have foundations coming in to these communities wanting to help, a lot of times that backfires if you don't listen first, and
Right.
you're not going to be effective. You're not going to be accomplishing the goal of the foundation, and you're definitely not going to be serving the communities well if you don't talk to them first and understand it directly from the ground. So I appreciate you doing that. Marisol, do you have anything to add to that about really focusing on, or how can you work with your colleagues in philanthropy to help make them realize the differences between a land acknowledgement and real action?
Sure. No, thank you. I echo everything that Shawn just mentioned. It's about listening, and it's about patience, showing up for Native communities, letting them know you truly care, and that you're going to be there beyond the proposal, right? Once it gets approved and you get that check, that's it, right? No, it doesn't work that way. I think, from my experience working with tribal communities, really capacity building is a big issue, and being that funder that can tell them, look, this is what we can do to increase to make it a more powerful proposal, and being a connector, right? If there's other funders out there that can support, be that connector. As we know in philanthropy, everything is about relationships and who you know. Also, regrettably, philanthropic support is so transactional in many of our institutions, and Native communities just don't work that way. We must break bread. We listen, and we're patient. Gaining trust is essential. It's not a quid pro quo, right? It's not about sexy philanthropy. It's truly about investing in a people that are experts in their respective communities. And, when I say patience, I don't mean like in a month or so. It may take months to gain the trust needed, but it's worth it. Funders must recognize this. It's not on our terms. The process, sometimes it's long. Even when I switched over to Cal Wellness, there was one Native nonprofit, and it took them 6 months to submit their proposal. But I had that patience. I wasn't rushing them. I was there throughout the whole way, letting them know, let me know your questions, because there's a lot of trauma involved, right? In providing data, and why do you want this, and so forth. So you have to have that flexibility. If they don't want to provide something, we need to talk and say, okay, what can we do? What are you willing to share with me? Because we have to acknowledge that inherent power balance that we have as a funder, and to really be there. It's not our agenda. We need to have the patience to pivot, even if that means creating a separate application for Native communities. So I think that's what's really important.
Yes, relationships are so key, and especially in Indian country. I mean, you're going to have to come out, and I appreciate Shawn and Marisol, going out to these communities, going out to the reservations, going out to the urban Indian communities, and talking directly with them, having a feast with them, participating in ceremony if you're invited. Getting on a horse, Shawn. I mean, hey, you can always come up to Nez Perce country. I mean, we
not getting on the horse is okay.
We developed the Appaloosa. They're beautiful horses. They're tame. We can come up, and I'll take you on a ride.
I respect my friends. I don't need to jump on their backs.
But that at times that's what it takes to build that trust, because as you said, we've been burned. We've been burned before, and we've been exploited We've been, there's been extraction of resources, extraction of wisdom, extraction of people, of human beings. There's a lot of trauma, like you said. So making that, you have to be really intentional and taking that first step. Philanthropy does, to reach out and to develop those meaningful relationships. And that means getting out there, investing the time. And I appreciate you mentioning that sometimes it means changing the processes of the individual foundations in order to make it happen, because this is a different kind of approach, and we have to look at what the communities what they need in order to get into this philanthropic sector. And so thank you for being flexible. Thank you for being able to pivot and to understand how the Indigenous communities see this big giant philanthropic sector, $500 billion. I mean, when I got into it, it blew my mind. I had only had a very little experience with individual foundations when I was on my tribal council, and I didn't know the scope of this, and I didn't know the origins, as Greg and Erik mentioned, about where this wealth was generated, and the history, and so all that adds up to why tribes aren't engaged, and they aren't, and so we need, and that's what Native Americans in Philanthropy is here to do, is to be that bridge, to create those spaces so we can have meaningful relationships, and that the philanthropic sector can do it in the right way, like you guys are doing. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. And as I mentioned, it starts with awareness, right? Creating change starts with the awareness, and part of that is the development of these land acknowledgements. I think it came from a good space, but we're in a moment where there's an opportunity and a need to elevate that awareness into action. We've all heard the quote, "When you know better, you do better." As a funder, what does you mentioned a couple examples already, but could you expand on what does doing better look like to you, Marisol?
Sure. I think for me, doing better means it's not a one and done, right? Awareness comes in layers. You keep learning as you go. I know I still am. Doing better would be doing wealth acknowledgements as well, right? Foundations need to recognize how their wealth was originated. So if you're going to do a land acknowledgement, do a wealth acknowledgement as well. Doing better is not dictating the need. Don't assume what the needs are as a funder. Just because you're reading articles and listening to NPR and the news doesn't make you an expert in Indian country. You need to go directly to these tribal leaders and Native nonprofit leaders to hear what the need is. Don't develop the agenda. Be a true servant leader. That's doing better.
Thanks, Marisol. Shawn,
Yep.
What does doing better mean to you?
I mean, I love Marisol's answer, and that servant leadership is absolutely important. The really being there for a community, spending time in the communities that you're serving as foundations. We typically have pretty cushy jobs, and sometimes they're really far removed from the issues or communities that we're serving. And it's easy not to really step in to a community. And I think to do this work effectively, you have to be in community as much as possible, regardless of if you're serving Native Americans or the African American community or a Latino community. It makes a difference if you're actually spending time, your personal time, not as a sort of big bad foundation, but as an individual, right? With a degree of intention and a degree of sincerity as well. And there's a question in the chat about sort of further understanding Indian country. Indian country is really big. As the map will tell you. I do think we do need to have more site visits there to different tribes, different tribal lands, but not in a way that it's a sort of a spectator sport, where you're going on a bus and you're driving around and you're getting out, you're listening, and then you're getting back on your bus, and then you're leaving. There's no leave behind, right? So if we can do site visits in a way that is meaningful, right, in terms of the learning for the foundations, but also we are funders, so leave some dollars, perhaps contribute to a pooled fund, just acknowledging that folks are taking their time to welcome you into their community. We need to do this in a way that we're also providing some resources, or provide technical assistance hours, volunteer to review an application, give advice, make the connections to other funders, things like that.
Thanks, Shawn. Marisol, anything to add on what opportunities are out there to engage funders so that they can dive in deeper and understand more of the breadth of Indian country?
Well, no, I think Shawn really covered it. I really think that partnering with organizations as well, if you're not sure, that's where I think NAP is a great resource, and being that connector. And I think definitely echo, the site visits. Those are important. And I remember, people also forget, right, that every tribe is different, and all tribes are not drummers. And all tribes are not bird singers. There's different types. And I think educating yourself and going to the site visits that interest you, but doing so respectfully, right? And going there to really learn, like, what's the purpose of going? To Shawn's point, you don't want to be a spectator, right? I think that's really important, because for me, I remember going first to Nez Perce, actually. And I asked, like, where are the gates? And that's because I was referencing what I knew working at a different tribe, right? And I remember, and this was like 2 years into my work, and they were laughing like, there's no gates here, right? But I think it's important to educate yourself, because it goes back to, you don't know what you don't know. And knowing how different every reservation is, and the beautiful traditions and cultural customs, I think it's important for you as a funder to respect that and know what like any site visit as a funder, right? There's nothing like going to a place and actually seeing the work in action, then reading it in a proposal.
Yeah, bring a board member too.
Exactly.
And not just staff. Bring some board members. We're sort of trying to work with our younger generation, and looking at some Indigenous Hawaiians, and doing a service learning in that community as well. So bring board members.
Yeah, that's great suggestion, Shawn. I know that because it's hard to move large organizations and change the philosophy and the thinking and the strategy that's been in place for quite some time, and so that's a really good example of something that would move the needle within your own boards and with your own stakeholders. Marisol, how would you did you have any other suggestions on how to support the board and the decision makers, the people with power within these foundations? How do you support them in becoming more aware and getting on that journey to becoming truly authentic allies with Indian country?
I think when I came with an eye in understanding where philanthropy was falling short, and I have educated the foundation in supporting Native communities. I've been fortunate where Cal Wellness has been extremely supportive about increasing funding to Native-led nonprofits. While they were hiring for my position, they specifically sought out someone that had this experience because they recognized there was a need to do more. We have a very diverse board, and they are all fully supportive. We have one board member that is tribal, so we're very fortunate that we have that voice. But if you're not in the same position as I am, I would recommend you start being that voice in the room and asking why not. why are we not supporting? Is it your process? Is it too long? If so, again, consider offering a new process or an application specifically targeted to Native communities that maybe is shorter and doesn't require all the data that funders don't even use. Or even start asking in your foundation, okay, if you're not funding to Native nonprofits, are you supporting Native consultants, right? How many Native consultants are you working with? If you're working on a strategic plan internally, did you interview Native consultants? So I would start with at least being that voice in the room to acknowledge that we need to do more.
Yeah, I appreciate Native Americans in Philanthropy, 30 plus years in this field and supporting our tribal members to get into this field, to start a career within philanthropy, to work within the system, because there wasn't that voice in the past. And I think there are more and more voices at the table now, not just Native, but our true allies and partners and friends. And I think you're right, we need more of them to step up. I think it's uncomfortable at times. But we just know that you have all these tribes that are standing with you and supporting you. Because when we're going out NAP and we're talking directly with tribal leaders or Indigenous communities, they have expressed the interest and a desire to get into this space and to create these relationships, but they're also hesitant and they're also skeptical. And so having more of the allies and voices who support within the system would greatly increase the potential for these partnerships to go into fruition, and for those resources for that turn that curve around, from 0.5% of all philanthropic giving going to tribal communities, to dramatically increase that, to change that curve, to right some historical wrongs, and to really really invest in the communities, and let them trust them and let them do the work as well. So I appreciate you talking about tribal consultants, Native consultants. There's all these individual businesses and firms and nonprofits that also have experience and wisdom and a perspective that is necessary for it to be successful. And so that is an important point to make. And we call it like buy Indian, with the tribes. All of our businesses, the government, we want to make sure that dollar cycles within Indian country, because we know that all this wealth is going out. Like we talked about the extraction, the history of just the exploitation and extraction. And so we want to right that historical wrong and start moving it in the right direction. This is we talked about, Erik and Greg talked about it a little, about this being a difficult and challenging discussion at times when we're talking about our foundations wanting to do the right thing and wanting to respect and honor the tribes, but that they might take some wrong steps. they might not do it correctly, and so sometimes these land acknowledgements have come under scrutiny. And that's legitimate, as we talked about. And so how do we move beyond it just being performative? And we don't want the scrutiny, the legitimate scrutiny, to be a deterrent for funders to keep going down this road, to become an authentic ally, to do it in the right way, right? Right. What would you say to other funders who are hesitant to approach getting involved with Indigenous communities, or to those who don't know where to start? Shawn? I think the audio is off.
Sorry about that. I said it was profound. It was amazing, and you guys missed it. And now I'm done. No,
mic drop.
I would say that I don't know if folks are hesitant in funding Native communities, or if they're just it's a population not seen, right? We have a pretty poor track record in seeing all communities. And it's something that it takes the people inside the machine of philanthropy to make the changes. So the more Native folks that we get inside as program staff and as foundation leaders, the better. And for those that have been doing land acknowledgements, it's great that it comes from usually from a position of compassion, or you're compelled to do it, and you're understanding, you're seeking to learn. I would encourage them to talk to their colleagues about that, and talk to the why you're doing the acknowledgement. And then making sure that you're always following the acknowledgement with acknowledging how little you are doing, if you're representing a foundation, how little the foundation is doing in support, or the field of philanthropy in general in support of Native issues. So making sure that that is always front and center too. You're acknowledging lands, and you're acknowledging that this field that you're operating in isn't doing enough. Maybe it's like name and shame. I'm up for every method to try to increase resources.
Yeah, I would love to answer that too, Bill. Yeah, I would say think outside the box. So I think funders must acknowledge that many Native-led nonprofits don't focus on just one issue. They don't fit in the standard box of an issue area. Everything is interconnected for tribal communities. For example, many funders aren't clear. Many funders are very clear on what they fund, right? Like health, education. But regrettably, many funders don't fund areas like language and culture, and they label it as art. But in my experience, Native communities don't view it as such. In fact, the word art, right, doesn't really exist in Native languages, because language and cultural traditions like basket weaving are viewed as wellness. And it's an interconnected part of a resiliency of a people. And these issues don't fit in a checkbox. So this may not align with the funder's goal of supporting their clearly defined checkbox of program areas. But if you're a funder that's supporting racial justice and you're not supporting Indigenous languages, then you're not supporting key issues important to Indigenous communities. Supporting language or other cultural ceremonies is a racial justice issue. It may not align neatly in your box, but it should be supported, because these traditions were lost, right, because of settler colonialism. And funders need to be supporting it, especially with language when so many of the elders are passing. It's a critical issue. So I think it's important to think outside the box.
Yeah. So important. And in my short time in philanthropy, I've I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by all of the affinity groups and sort of like the silos and boxes that foundations put themselves in, because we see that in all tribal government too. But that also lends to this boxed in thinking that you just talked about, Marisol. So like in my field, the conservation, environmental work, climate change work, it's all interconnected from a tribal perspective, from Indigenous perspective. But we're having to fit within these individual funding boxes when it comes to environmental work, which is we're trying to change that narrative. We're trying to get tribal leaders and community leaders to have the direct conversations with the funders, so they can share that perspective that, okay, when you're saving a language. When you're right, Marisol, it's sad when you go to my tribe or other tribes, especially during this COVID era. So many of our elders are passing away, we're trying with our language programs and cultural resource programs to preserve and to protect and to save these languages, but the rate, it's so tough to keep pace because these are very difficult languages to learn. You talked about they were all oral; they were not written down, and so we had linguists come in, but it's in our DNA to learn it by conversation orally, and so that takes time, right? And these are long-term initiatives, and so we need that long-term relationships with foundations, multi-year funding to make sure that we can save these languages, save these cultural teachings, because it goes back to that impacts the health, mental health, physical health, the connections with the land and with all the species, and it goes back to saving those ecosystems and those species so that we can continue that way of life. And so it's all connected, right? And we're trying to get that perspective inside these foundations. And so really appreciate you guys doing that work inside to lift up the tribes and our perspectives. Because we are in a critical time, a really critical time for a lot of our cultures, a lot of our languages. And it goes directly to our identity. And another key component of that is land. And, it goes back to, why we're here today to talk about land acknowledgements and going beyond that, because we are place-based people. My tribe, we've been there for thousands and thousands of years, and when we were forced to move to Oklahoma for a couple of years, I mean it devastated us. And I can only imagine the tribes that are still in Oklahoma are still not in their traditional territories, and to look at the impact on the people, their individual mental and spiritual health. And so when we're talking about land, and I think that's these land acknowledgements, when they're not genuine, when they're not backed up with action or with resources being put in that's what gets into the skin of tribal members, because it's one thing to just say that we're on the land of, like, I'm right now zooming in from Suquamish tribal land in the state of Washington, just outside of Seattle, they've developed their own land acknowledgement when they're dealing with local governments and businesses and everything. But it goes beyond that, because it's something that can be like checking the box. And so I appreciate going to the heart of the matter when it's talking about really supporting tribal communities and supporting their priorities of bringing back their people so self sustainability, and really bringing back their way of life. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I think it's directed at Marisol. How would you recommend that someone gets similar experience to yours living in Los Angeles?
Similar experience in what regard? Like serving Native communities? I guess I would recommend connecting with the tribal nonprofits in Los Angeles. Like, I could think of like United American Indian Involvement. There's the California Native Vote Project. There's a Southern California Indian Center. There's so many that are serving urban Native Americans that I would recommend starting there first. They have a lot of events, or even events, right? I know there's respective schools like UCLA and so forth that host their own powwows, because from there, then you meet vendors that are there serving the needs of the community. So that's a great way to start. I hope I answered your question.
It also might mean getting into philanthropy as well. Could you maybe talk about your path into philanthropy?
Sure. Yeah. Like I had mentioned, I mean, I really was fortunate in how philanthropy kind of just landed on my lap with the tribe, because when I started with the tribe, I started as a public affairs representative, and I was starting when all the propositions were going on, and their gaming was just starting. I started when they just had a bingo hall. It was just a small little bingo hall. And when they started, and to your point, Shawn, like, and Joel, for tribes, philanthropy, it's something that they've been doing since time immemorial. That's just part of their culture of giving back. And they just wanted to start a program. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that core group to really create a robust charitable giving program that other tribes have duplicated. They've replicated it just because it's such a great program. And I have wonderful colleagues over there still running that program. So, for philanthropy, getting into a tribal philanthropy is difficult. Just because, again, the trust, a lot of the times people that start working there don't leave just because it's so wonderful. Really, working for a tribe, it was a privilege for me because you work for a nation. You work for a people. It's not a corporation, and the resiliency, it's just a beautiful thing. But working in philanthropy, obviously, I would recommend you connect with affinity groups, right? Or the Southern California Grant Makers Association. They can be that connector in giving you that exposure that you may need. Shawn, please feel free to jump in.
I think that's just it. In terms of making sure you're doing your research about what funders exist, and the so-called grant makers is a great resource. As people of color, I don't think we've traditionally saw ourselves in philanthropy. It wasn't. I definitely wasn't thinking that this would be my career path. But it's important that we that we get in the door, and two, that we're applying for all the opportunities to get into that door. So just keep your eyes open for different opportunities. Make sure you're looking to the affinity groups, and if there's a specific subject or area expertise, there's traditionally an affinity group for you.
Thanks, Shawn. Maybe if you could talk a little bit more, because I'm sure there's a lot of folks listening in who aren't in the philanthropic sector but would like to and be part of this change that we're talking about, and strengthening these allyships and partnerships with tribes in a meaningful, genuine way. How did you get into philanthropy, Shawn? How could others take that same path that you blazed?
Yeah, well, I had a long career in the nonprofit sector, where I was used to begging foundations for resources. And then I was, I sort of historically was just upset with the field. I didn't like program officers. I didn't like foundations. I thought most of them were full of BS, or didn't know the issues or communities that they say that they're working in. And, I'm actually down in New Orleans right now, and I was in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, helping rebuild. And the first, worked for a nonprofit. The first grant that I was managing was eventually the foundation I went to work for in New York. It was the Certain Foundation. And I told them about themselves, not having real expertise in what was happening on the ground, sort of parachuting in and out of communities and not really committing. So when the opportunity to apply for a role in philanthropy, I was hesitant, but I did it because I thought I could do it differently. I almost quit my first year. I thought, people spoke weird and, this sort of philanthropy speak. And there was a degree of arrogance as well. And some people lean into the power imbalance, while others are very conscious of it. And I was extremely conscious of it. but it was just an important role for me to be in, because I knew that I would make different decisions. I inherited a portfolio that was mostly white-led organizations, and before I left, it was 90% people of color-led organizations, and that was intentional. I made sure that it wasn't just the grants that we were making, but it was the consultants that we were hiring, and all other sort of contracts that we were letting, that we were making sure that you could identify BIPOC-led orgs, companies, and Native-led groups, and but it takes intentionality, and it takes sort of real commitment, acknowledging that our whole apparatus of philanthropy has done very, very bad things to perpetuate sort of current imbalances.
I appreciate that, Shawn. I know we all have our own unique paths and how we got into philanthropy, and mine, like I said, I came from politics, tribal politics, and into policy world, working at state level and federal levels, focusing on ensuring that we're protecting our lands and waters back on tribal lands, and manage federal lands that we still are guaranteed the right to harvest our first foods, fishing, hunting, gathering. So that was my world for the majority of my professional life. And this opportunity to get involved with Native Americans in philanthropy and shift more resources to tribes and communities from the sector just kind of came out of the blue, really. But it actually was the leadership of Erik Stegman, our CEO here, just building up our team in the last couple of years, and really being intentional and strategic about focusing on forging these relationships, these pathways for resources to flow to tribes, and for them to tell their story, and for them to really guide and direct where those resources are going. And so it wasn't something I was looking for, but I'm glad I'm in this space. I love being on the policy side of things. But the wins were few and far between. They were long slogs, and I appreciate. It's kind of scary at times, but I appreciate the speed at which philanthropy can move. And I think if they have the right intention in their minds and in their hearts, I think that speed is definitely an asset. And it shows that things can move fairly quickly if they want it to. And so it's shifting that mindset among the decision makers and where that power is held. And we have a comment or a question in the chat, and it goes to how can others around the United States and around the world, what can they do to increase visibility in your funders world?
Yeah. I would say it's like waving as many flags as possible, and inviting funders, to your communities and to events. A lot of philanthropy is hearts and minds work, right? Where you're touching someone's heart and mind, and having these sort of experiences will hopefully, lead to them opening up their wallets, or really thinking more seriously about funding priorities. So it is, identifying funders in your area and inviting them out to events. It doesn't have to be an ask, but there's a, hey, come check us out, see what we're doing here. We want to invite you to this event, and we want to show you some of our customs. And we want to show you, perhaps some of the things that we need resources for, but it's really opening up the door to sort of come into Indian country.
Gotcha. Marisol, do you have anything to add? And I think the question was also in reference to like how they can get in these spaces or in the room with funders. Did you have any suggestions for them?
I recommend an old-fashioned phone call. I know a lot of people don't, I know nonprofits and so forth, sometimes community groups are hesitant to call funders or, sometimes emails, we get a lot of emails. So I would recommend picking up the phone call and introducing yourself and just being intentional on what you need support with, right? Whether you're inviting them to a local event or letting them know about your program. I think that's always worked for me, is a phone call that rather than an email, because I think it lets people know, right, that you're really trying to reach out and be intentional about that relationship building as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm still a fan of the old school phone call.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that the new upcoming generations, they kind of they're text all, email all, but hey, I still love a good phone call. One question we have in the chat that goes directly to our conversation we were having around tribal governments, tribal nations, and the sovereign governments that we have, 574 across the United States. Is it possible to promote monies for collaborating to support tribal sovereignty? And they gave some examples on providing travel assistance, getting natives in the door, and advocating for representation.
I think with funders, depending on your capability of funding, like for example, right, California Wellness Foundation is a statewide foundation, so we're only able to support within California. But if you're a funder that's supporting nationwide, there's great organizations, like one that comes to mind, right, is a Native Governance Center that it supports a lot of the pipeline leadership for tribal governments, and also being able as a funder to directly support tribes, right? I think a lot of funders shy away from that and they're scared to support tribal governments, but philanthropy can support tribal governments. They are identified as a 501c3 per IRS guidelines. So, and I know First Nations Development Institute is also a great resource for this, for funders that are starting to look into that. So I think that's important as well, to realize that supporting the nation is something that shouldn't be overlooked, and the funder can do so directly.
Yeah, but I also think there's a challenge in who's leading the effort to bring all the tribes together. I think raising dollars for travel and consultants and technical assistance, that's feasible as long as there's a coordinating entity.
Mm-hmm.
And with some philanthropies, foundations, it's there are also things tied to metrics and outcomes, and so what would be the outcome? What are you trying to measure? What will you have to show for this type of gathering, and how many would it take to actually move the needle on a particular issue?
Yeah, just as
and
an
I think
example.
there's other.
Oh, go ahead,
oh, yeah, no, that's a great point, Shawn. And I think of organizations that are there for coalition building, right? For some tribes, like I think of Masten in Southern California, the Tribal Alliance Sovereignty organization that has a coalition of Southern California tribes that also have a 501c3 arm that can then step in and be that support, to your point. So I think that's an excellent point.
Thanks for that. I was just going to mention that there to the audience member's question. We specifically got support from a couple funders to provide travel assistance for tribal leaders, elected leaders, who didn't have the means to go to Washington D.C. for the upcoming White House Tribal Leaders Summit that President Biden called. We know that 574 tribes, and from very remote areas, especially Alaska, with over 200 tribes up there. They don't necessarily have the means to get to those really important discussions, and so funders stepped up with $100,000 to provide travel assistance. So I think definitely there are funders out there who are realizing that being present in those spaces, even in this virtual world, but to be that face-to-face. We talked about the phone calls, right? The relationship building requires some of that face-to-face time or direct conversations, and so to be at those spaces is super important. And we have funders who realize that as well and are helping to support tribes. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Another one from the chat is, and I'll direct it to Marisol first. Why do you think it's so hard for philanthropy to make financial investments and systematic challenges to couple with a land acknowledgement? Maybe they mean.
That's a great question. I think it echoes to the points earlier of it's hard for philanthropy to create these financial investments because everything is in a box, right? It's so black and white. Like, we support health, but it has to be this, this, and this, and this, versus not looking at it in the view of cultural traditions. Basket weaving is health. It's wellness for tribes. So I think that's the biggest barrier from my experience, is funders not realizing the holistic approach to health and well-being that tribal communities have, and how, again, back to being interconnected, and it doesn't fit neatly in the box. So right away, you decline them because they're not serving exactly your portfolio goal. That's, I think, the biggest challenge. Shawn?
You're absolutely right about the boxes that we create, and we create all the rules besides the IRS rules anyway. But it's just hard, right? You do a land acknowledgement, providing financial resources. It's like, then, okay, if you're a funder that's working in 10 different communities across the country, are you providing resources to 10 different tribes or 30 different tribes, because the regions that you're covering are also covering multiple tribes? There's an issue of what's the right number? Is it aligned to a mission or vision of your foundation? Is it connected to any program area? And then you're going to get into just other questions about other communities. Are you doing the same thing for the African American community? Are you doing the same thing for the Latino community? Are you doing the same thing for the Asian community? We get into these weird, sometimes competition for funding and or just down a rabbit hole of how do we do right by as many people as possible? How do we show up better in a very imperfect world with a very imperfect tool of philanthropy?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I appreciate your insights on that question. I'm really looking in the mirror and understanding some of the internal challenges within your various foundations, and making sure that we're strategic in trying to change that system and ensure that we increase resources flowing to tribes and as nations, but also Indigenous communities as well. To close this discussion, we provided some space for some closing comments. Our audience, I don't know how many are currently watching us right now, but I think we're up over 500 or so as of yesterday. So I really appreciate all those folks who dedicated some time with us today. But they're largely funders in the room with us, with opportunities, huge opportunities to change philanthropy with you. What is the one thing you want to leave with them, so they have a better understanding of? And I'll pass it to Shawn first.
Well, it's not so that we have a better understanding. I'll just say, just do more, right? Do more than what you're doing right now. For most of us, that's like we're not doing anything. So if you make one grant, that's 1,000 times better. But simply do more. It's not difficult to fund in Native communities. It's not difficult to fund BIPOC-led organizations. A lot of the constraints are ones that we put on ourselves, and some things that we tell ourselves are difficult. NAP is an incredible resource. You can talk to the team there. They can help you navigate different communities. You can get introductions to different tribes, and things aren't done in a day. You have time to build and learn, but simply do more is what I would suggest.
Appreciate that, Shawn. Marisol?
Thank you. I want to invite you to have the courage, and I want to invite you to be transformational. So be willing to have the courage to advocate for Native communities. Be willing to have the courage to not be so transactional, but be transformational with getting dollars into our Native communities. So let me tell you some steps that you can take right now. Identify why you aren't funding to more Native communities. Is it your board? Is it that they don't fit nicely in your checkbox of program areas? Once you identify what's holding your foundation back, begin those conversations and build those partnerships. Just like Shawn said, members like NAP are a great resource. And also talk to other funders. Add this as a personal goal. Second, I invite you to educate yourself about Native communities near your home, near your place of work. Native communities have been here since time immemorial. What tribes are near you? And don't just use the map like they give out in Zoom. Yeah, it goes beyond this. Pick up a book and learn. The erasure of Native people due to the lack of representation is concerning. And Native people are not seen and they're not heard. And this must change. For example, so many people are not aware that the day after Thanksgiving is known as Native American Heritage Day. Educate yourself. And in turn, educate your family, your friends, and your children. Begin there. It's not about the box. It's about the heart and the soul.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Marisol. Well said. Yeah, and it is timely, right? We're in Native American Heritage Month. We have Native American Heritage Day on this Friday. Hopefully it'll be a national holiday fairly soon. That's been an effort from tribes to get that on the calendar. But we celebrate it, and thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marisol and Shawn, for joining us today. This was an extremely insightful discussion. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you to all who joined us virtually. We're so proud of the work being accomplished through relationships like the ones we have with today's speakers. And we hope that these examples help each of you in your own work. Next week, we have Giving Tuesday. As we head into that Giving Tuesday, we ask that you please consider ways that you can take land acknowledgement a step further and help support the work being done by tribes and Native-led organizations. Here at Native Americans in Philanthropy, we are partnering with Native Ways Federation through the #GiveNative movement. We stand with Native Ways Federation in agreement that Native-led organizations have the solutions to the issues that Native communities are facing. And by investing in Native-led spaces, you can help enhance positive change. We encourage you to visit nativeways.org /Giving Tuesday 2022. And we'll have that link posted hopefully in the chat as well as in a follow-up email. Please go to that website to learn more about the opportunities that help carry this change forward. And finally, a friendly reminder, you'll be receiving an evaluation following today's broadcast. Please take time to share your thoughts. It only takes about 3 minutes, and it really does help us to improve these types of events. And another way you can turn this these awesome words into action is also looking at other ways to invest in tribes and indigenous communities. And one way I'd like to share with you is through our Tribal Nations Conservation Pledge and Fund Collaborative. And that's a newly created fund and pledge by Native Americans in Philanthropy that we just launched a couple of weeks ago. And that's a specific, if you're a foundation who funds directly in conservation work to protection of land and waters and species, the tribes are leaders in this space. Like we talked about, we have been for the first stewards of our lands and waters and ecosystems for thousands and thousands of years. So please invest in tribes to protect and restore our lands and waters. This session closes our 2022 member education season. We are so grateful to each of you for joining us on this journey. We hope to see you again in January as we launch our 2023 education season and look forward to continuing the work we do together. If you're not an app member and want to get involved, please visit nativephilanthropy.org or email Rod Jacobs at rjacobs@nativephilanthropy.org to learn more. And thank you to our whole team at Native Americans in Philanthropy and Tuttle Co. and Marisol and Shawn and everybody involved in the production of this event, and to all of you for joining us. Thank you. Have a great day and a happy holiday filled with family and joy and laughter. And till we meet again, thank you. Yok kalo.